She thought she knew the kind of person she was, until one moment shattered that illusion, until a stranger's quiet, unwavering strength exposed the ugliness in her own reflection, and by the time she realized the weight of her mistake, it was already too late. But some mistakes don't just haunt you, they change you forever. The low hum of the airplane engines droned beneath the hushed conversations of passengers settling in for their evening flight from Chicago to Denver. Among them, near the center of the cabin, sat a man in a dark hoodie, his face shadowed under the brim of a worn baseball cap. His posture was rigid, his fingers tapping in anxious rhythm against his knee. A few rows ahead, a woman in her mid-50s adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, her diamond bracelet catching the dim cabin light. She exuded an air of practiced confidence, but her eyes flicked warily toward the hooded man. Something about him unsettled her. She watched as he pulled a small black notebook from his jacket, flipping through pages covered in cramped, erratic handwriting. She stiffened, her lips pursed. The flight attendant made her way down the aisle, greeting passengers with a warm smile, but as she neared the hooded man, her smile faltered. Just for a second, the woman noticed, and that was enough to set her mind racing. As the flight ascended, the woman turned to the businessman beside her, lowering her voice. "Did you see that man back there? The one in the hoodie?" The businessman barely glanced up from his tablet, uninterested. "Looks nervous," she continued. "And that notebook, there's something off about him." The businessman sighed, shifting in his seat. "Ma'am, it's been a long day. Maybe he's just—" But then they heard it, a faint metallic click. The woman's breath caught. The hooded man sat perfectly still now, his hands resting atop the notebook, fingers curled slightly, as if poised to close it at any moment. The air in the cabin seemed to shift. The flight attendant had paused near the cockpit, her posture unnaturally stiff. Something was wrong. The woman's pulse quickened. Then in the heavy silence, the hooded man slowly turned his head, locking eyes with her. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, as passengers settled into their seats, unaware that this flight would soon become unforgettable. Near the middle of the plane, a man sat motionless, his posture unusually composed, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans. He looked unremarkable at first glance, but there was something unsettling about the way he held himself, too still, too controlled. His fingers traced the edges of a leather-bound notebook, resting on his lap, his eyes scanning the pages with quiet intensity. A few rows ahead, an elegantly dressed woman in her late 50s shifted uncomfortably. Her gaze flicked toward him, then quickly away, as if she'd caught sight of something she wasn't supposed to see. Her manicured fingers tightened around the handle of her designer handbag. There was a faint air of nervousness about her, something just beneath the surface, a tension she seemed desperate to conceal. She pressed the call button, her movements precise. Within moments a flight attendant, her badge reading Claire, approached with a polite smile. "Is there something I can do for you, ma'am?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward the man, and then lowering her voice. "I'd like to change seats." Claire's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, but the flight is fully booked. Is something wrong?" The woman exhaled sharply, clearly irritated. "No, it's fine. I'll manage." But her eyes kept drifting back to the man with the notebook. He hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged her, and yet she felt watched, though not by him, by something. The sensation was absurd, but it clung to her like an invisible thread, tightening with every passing second. The drink service began, but the tension didn't lift. As Claire poured a glass of wine for the woman, she cast another glance at the silent man. "He hasn't ordered anything," Claire murmured under her breath, almost to herself. The woman stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Since he boarded," Claire continued, keeping her voice light, "he hasn't spoken to anyone, not even when I asked if he wanted a drink." The woman's throat went dry. She turned back toward him, this time watching closely. His hand hovered just above the notebook now, unmoving. The pages beneath his fingers were filled with something dense, scribbled lines of text. But then she noticed something else. The ink. It was fresh. He was writing. But not now. Not during the flight. He hadn't moved his pen. A chill crept down her spine. The businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the air. "Everything okay?" he asked. The woman licked her lips, trying to shake off the ridiculous sense of unease. "It's just something feels wrong." The words had barely left her mouth when the cabin lights flickered. The plane jolted, just a small tremor, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the lights stabilized, the man in the sweater finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned the page of his notebook, and for the first time the woman saw what was written. Her breath hitched. It was her name. The plane hummed softly as it soared above the clouds, a sea of passengers lost in their own worlds. Among them, near the middle of the cabin, sat a man with an air of quiet detachment. His posture was controlled, his movements precise. Dressed in a dark jacket and pressed slacks, he looked like any other traveler, but there was something almost unsettling about the way he sat. Too still, too composed. His fingers rested on a small leather-bound notebook, the pages filled with meticulous slanted handwriting. A few rows ahead, a woman shifted in her seat, her manicured nails tapping restlessly against her armrest. She was in her early 50s, well-dressed, with the kind of presence that demanded attention. Yet, despite the luxury of her tailored blazer and expensive perfume, unease flickered in her sharp eyes. Her gaze drifted toward the man, lingering for a second too long. She looked away quickly, but the tension remained. It started with a whisper. "Strange," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for the older gentleman beside her to hear. "People like that, you'd think they'd be in first class, or at least somewhere else." The man next to her hesitated, offering an awkward shrug, clearly not wanting to engage. But she wasn't finished. "He hasn't spoken a word since he boarded. Haven't seen him eat. He's just been writing." Her voice had the sharp edge of suspicion, laced with something else, something darker. Meanwhile, a young boy from the row in front of the quiet man peeked over the seat, his curious eyes fixed on him. "Are you a writer?" the child asked innocently. The man's gaze lifted from his notebook, his expression unreadable at first. Then, after a beat, he offered a small measured smile. "Something like that." The boy's mother turned, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, he's just curious." The man nodded slightly, closing the notebook with deliberate care. "Curiosity's a good thing," he said, his voice calm. Yet, as the woman met his eyes for the briefest moment, she felt something stir in her chest, an instinct, a whisper of unease. There was weight behind his words. The flight continued, but the air felt heavier now. The woman in the tailored blazer kept stealing glances back at him, unable to shake a nagging thought. Then the plane jolted slightly, not turbulence, just a minor shift, but enough to make her pulse quicken. She pressed the call button. Within seconds, a flight attendant, her badge reading Claire, appeared. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" The woman hesitated before speaking. "I'd like to change seats." Claire's brows knit together. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked." A pause. Then, in a hushed, urgent tone, the woman asked, "Are you sure?" She glanced toward the quiet man again. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted at all. Claire followed her gaze, then back to the woman. "Is something wrong?" The woman swallowed, suddenly unsure. "No, no, it's fine." But her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water. Just as she took a sip, the man in the dark jacket did something for the first time since the flight began. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He turned it over in his palm, staring at it as if it held the weight of the world. The chatter around the cabin seemed to fade. The woman's breath caught in her throat, and then, just as suddenly, he opened the notebook again. This time the fresh page was blank, and yet somehow, impossibly, her name was already written there. The soldier exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the small velvet box, as if drawing strength from its weight. His eyes flickered shut for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. Before he reopened them, his face once again a mask of quiet composure. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, the quiet chatter of passengers creating a distant murmur around him. Yet, as still as he sat, as unaffected as he seemed, the truth was that he carried something heavier than anyone on that flight could comprehend. The woman in the tailored blazer barely glanced at him now, having long since dismissed him as insignificant. Her focus had shifted back to her in-flight magazine, flipping through the glossy pages without really reading them. Yet somewhere deep in her subconscious, a feeling lingered, an unease she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't fear, nor was it guilt. It was something else, a whisper of a realization she refused to acknowledge. Hours later, the flight touched down smoothly, and passengers filtered out one by one, dragging their luggage and exchanging polite nods with flight attendants. The soldier was among the last to disembark, stepping onto solid ground, with the same quiet determination he had maintained the entire journey. The next morning, thousands of miles away, sunlight streamed into a pristine suburban home in Scottsdale, Arizona. The woman from the flight sat at her dining table, her manicured fingers wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. Her morning routine was unchanged: black coffee, a quick scroll through emails, a glance at the news before heading into her mid-morning meeting. She wasn't thinking about the flight. To her it had been unremarkable, an inconvenient seating arrangement, a forgettable annoyance, until she saw the headline. It was bold, impossible to ignore. Local soldier returns home from final mission, carrying fallen comrades' ashes. Her thumb hesitated over the screen, hovering in place as something tightened in her chest. A strange sense of familiarity tugged at her. Slowly she clicked the link. The page loaded in seconds, and as her eyes landed on the photograph beneath the headline, the breath caught in her throat. There he was, the soldier from the plane. She blinked as if trying to convince herself she was mistaken, but it was him. The same calm, steady gaze, the same strong jawline, the same quiet intensity that had unsettled her in ways she hadn't been able to name. She kept reading, her heart pounding now. His name was Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole. He had just returned from his final tour overseas, but he hadn't been traveling alone. The velvet box, the one he had held so carefully, so reverently in his palm, wasn't just a trinket. It had contained the dog tags of Sergeant Daniel Reyes, his best friend, his brother-in-arms, the man who had died so that Nathan could live. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling against the cool surface of her phone. Nathan and Daniel had grown up together in El Paso, Texas. They had enlisted together, trained together, fought together. They had made a promise, one that had been tested in the most brutal way possible. During their last mission, an operation meant to extract civilians from a high-risk combat zone, an ambush had gone wrong. Gunfire, chaos, the explosion that changed everything. Daniel had seen it coming first. He hadn't hesitated. He had thrown himself in front of Nathan, shielding him from the blast. He had died instantly. Nathan had been the one to recover his body, to place the dog tags in his pocket, and swear to bring them home. Not just for Daniel's family, but because he owed it to him. Because a promise made in war was not one easily broken. The woman's vision blurred as her mind reeled back to the flight, to every sharp-tongued remark she had thrown his way, the way she had dismissed him, the irritation she had felt at his silence. He hadn't been ignoring her out of rudeness. He had been carrying grief too heavy for words, and still he had said nothing. Not in defense of himself, not in anger, not even to ease the tension around him. The coffee in her hands had gone cold. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say, because now she understood, and it was far too late to take back what she had said. The weight of her own words crashed down on her like an avalanche, suffocating and unrelenting. She sat motionless, her coffee forgotten, her breath shallow as she stared at the article on her phone. The soldier from the flight, Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole, wasn't just another passenger. He wasn't some nameless uniform. He had been on a mission far greater than any of them had known, one that didn't end on a battlefield, but in the silent, grief-stricken corridors of a homecoming. He had been carrying more than a velvet box that day. He had been carrying a promise, a final duty to a fallen brother. Her eyes flicked back to the screen, scanning the words again as if reading them for the first time. Sergeant Daniel Reyes. The name burned into her mind, the name of the man who had given his life so that Nathan could return home. They had been childhood friends, bound by a lifelong oath, and that oath had cost Daniel everything. The article described the moment Nathan had found him in the wreckage, the frantic scramble through dust and fire, the deafening sound of enemy fire closing in, the way Daniel had smiled, even in his final moments, as if he knew his sacrifice meant something. Nathan had refused to leave him behind. He had fought his way back, carrying his friend on his shoulders, dodging bullets, bleeding, pushing forward because he had made a promise. And now, days later, he had returned home with nothing but a set of dog tags, a handful of ashes, and a grief so profound it was impossible to put into words. She thought back to the flight, to every offhand remark, every dismissive glance, the way she had rolled her eyes, whispered under her breath about playing hero. She felt sick. Nathan had sat there silent, unshaken, while she had judged him without knowing the weight he bore. He had not defended himself. He hadn't needed to. She clenched her jaw, her stomach twisting in on itself. She had once known loss. She had once stood in the unbearable silence of grief, where words meant nothing, and even the smallest act of kindness could break you open. So how had she forgotten? Her mind drifted back to the night she lost her own brother. The way the world had felt different afterward, like everything had tilted slightly off its axis. The way people had spoken to her in hushed tones, or not at all. The way she had lashed out at a store clerk weeks later, snapping at a woman who had only asked if she needed help. The guilt of that moment had lingered for years, a reminder of how pain, left unchecked, could turn cruel. And yet Nathan hadn't lashed out. He had met her cruelty with silence, not out of indifference, but because he had been carrying something heavier than her words could ever be. She exhaled sharply, setting the phone down with a shaking hand. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were pressing in, urging her to do something to make this right. But how? She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply as sunlight crept through the window, casting long golden streaks across the floor. For the first time in a long time, she realized that guilt alone wasn't enough. She had to act, because some debts could never be repaid, but the least she could do was try. The realization struck her like a blow, sharp and inescapable. She had done it again. Judged, dismissed, wounded without thought or reason. This time, however, she had directed her careless cruelty at someone who had already endured far worse than she could ever comprehend. Her mind replayed the flight in excruciating detail, the way the soldier had sat in silence, absorbing every sharp-edged remark, every glance laced with condescension, never once retaliating. It hadn't been out of weakness, it had been out of strength, a strength she had never known, the kind that carried an unbearable weight without complaint. She could still see his face in her mind, not stoic, not detached, just steady, as if he had been holding on to something so much greater than the moment, something that had demanded every ounce of his resolve. And now reading about him, about Nathan Cole, the soldier she had so cruelly dismissed, she finally understood what that weight had been. It had been his best friend, his fallen brother in arms, Daniel Reyes, the man he had sworn to protect, the man he had killed, not just in life, but in death. The dog tags in that velvet box weren't just metal, they were a promise, a last tether to someone he had loved like family, and she had mocked him. A fresh wave of nausea roiled in her stomach. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls of her own ignorance had finally closed in. How had she become this person? Apologizing felt impossible. She didn't even know where to begin. Words felt too small, too hollow. Even if she found him, what could she say? That she was sorry, that she had been cruel without cause, that her small bitter words had been a drop in an ocean of loss he had already endured. And yet doing nothing felt even worse. She spent the next few hours searching, every article, every mention of his name. She needed to understand. She needed to know the man beyond that brief, painful encounter. The more she read, the deeper the ache settled in her chest. Nathan had started a foundation, not for himself, but for the families of soldiers like Daniel. Families who had lost everything, left to navigate a world that moved on too quickly. Her fingers trembled as she hovered over the donate button. It wasn't enough. It never would be, but it was something. A small step toward a debt she could never repay. When she typed her message, she agonized over every word. Nothing seemed right. Nothing seemed enough. But in the end, she kept it simple, honest. To Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole, I didn't know your story, but now I do, and I will never forget it. Thank you for your service, for your strength, for the grace you showed when I showed you nothing but unkindness. I was wrong, and I am sorry. I will carry this lesson with me for the rest of my life. When she pressed send, she exhaled sharply, as if releasing something that had lodged itself deep in her ribs. But the weight didn't lift. It never would. Some mistakes you carried with you, and maybe that was the point. That night she sat outside, watching the sky fade into darkness. The guilt still sat heavy in her chest, but it wasn't paralyzing anymore. Instead it had become resolve, a reminder that the person she had been wasn't the person she had to remain. She had spent so much of her life speaking without thinking. Now she wanted to listen, to understand, to be better. Not just for Nathan, but for every unseen battle people fought, for every moment when kindness mattered more than words. She sat in the dim light of her apartment, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of her. The article on her phone glowed in the darkness, each word sinking into her chest like lead. She had been wrong. So painfully, unforgivably wrong. The guilt didn't just weigh on her, it crushed her, suffocating in a way she had never experienced before. She had spent years believing she understood people, that she could read between the lines, see beyond the surface. But now she saw the truth. She had been blind, and he had paid the price for it. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the article again. The headline alone felt like a slap. Hero's sacrifice, and the brotherhood that never dies. The name stood out to her now, bold and unforgiving. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole. She had been on a flight with him, sitting just 2 seats away. She had watched him, or rather judged him, when the flight attendants had handled his request with an unusual reverence, when he had been allowed to board first, when people had whispered his name. She had scoffed internally. She had assumed, maybe he was one of those men who expected the world to bow at his feet because he had worn a uniform. Maybe he carried himself like a martyr, soaking in the attention. Maybe he was another self-righteous soldier, using tragedy to demand respect. The thoughts had flickered through her mind like static, unfiltered, unchecked. And then she had done worse than think them. She had spoken them, not directly, not to his face, but loud enough for him to hear. Not like he's the only one who's ever lost someone. She had muttered it to the woman beside her, shaking her head as if she were making some profound point, as if she, a stranger with no idea what this man had been through, had the right to reduce his grief to something ordinary. And Nathan Cole, he hadn't said a word, not a single syllable in defense, not a glare, not a sharp remark, just silence. And now as she sat alone with only the glow of her phone and the cold bitterness of her own words, she understood why. It wasn't because he was weak, it was because he was strong, stronger than she had ever been. The article told her everything she hadn't known. Nathan Cole had been returning home from a mission, but not alone. His best friend, Sergeant Adam Hayes, hadn't made it back alive. Nathan had carried him, not just in spirit, but in body, across enemy lines, through gunfire, past the kind of horrors she couldn't even imagine. He had refused to leave Adam behind, refused to let his best friend's final journey be in the hands of strangers. He had brought him home. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the image was burned into her mind now. Nathan Cole standing in full uniform beside a flag-draped casket, his expression unshakable, yet filled with the kind of sorrow words could never capture. How could she have been so cruel? The memories of her own loss surged forward. Her brother, the car accident, the unbearable ache that had swallowed her whole, the way she had lashed out at a cashier for simply asking, "How's your day going?" The cashier hadn't deserved her anger, and Nathan Cole hadn't deserved her words. She inhaled sharply. This guilt wasn't enough. Feeling sorry for herself wasn't enough. She had to do something. With a newfound urgency, she searched for more. She learned about the charity Nathan had started in Adam's honor, a fund to help families of fallen soldiers, a way to carry on his friend's legacy. Her heart pounded. It wasn't much, but it was something. She clicked the donate button. Her hands trembled as she typed out the amount, more than she had ever given to anything before, but it still didn't feel like enough. And then finally she wrote, "To Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole, I spoke when I should have listened, judged when I should have sought to understand. I was wrong, and I am sorry. Your strength is something I can only hope to learn from." She hovered over the send button. She didn't expect him to reply. Maybe he wouldn't even read it, but this wasn't about a response. It was about acknowledging the wrong and making a choice to be better. She hit send. The days that followed were different. She moved through the world more carefully. She listened more, spoke less. She noticed things she had once overlooked, the tired eyes of a single mother at the grocery store, the quiet grief hidden behind forced smiles, the battles people fought behind closed doors. Nathan Cole's silence had taught her something that her own words never could, and she carried that lesson with her. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was unwritten, and she was determined to get it right. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: every word we speak is a choice, and sometimes the strongest thing we can do is choose silence, choose kindness, choose to understand. If this resonates with you, share this story. Let's make the world a little less cruel, because sometimes one moment of grace can change everything.